the timeless enigma, God, eternity, and the curious dance of existence. The nature of God, that elusive and profound subject of contemplation for millennia, has always been intertwined with the riddle of time. Does the divine entity exist within its ceaseless flow, a majestic captain navigating the currents of history? Or does God stand outside it, a silent observer on the shores of eternity, watching the unfolding drama of existence with an awareness that transcends our linear understanding? This question, one of the oldest and most perplexing in theology and philosophy, opens doors to a vast and intriguing labyrinth of ideas, touching upon the very essence of creation, free will, and the relationship between the finite and the infinite. To embark on this intellectual journey, we must first acknowledge the inherent limitations of our temporal perspective. As creatures bound by the relentless march of seconds, minutes, and years, we struggle to comprehend a reality that might exist beyond, or perhaps even before, the framework of time itself. Our language, our logic, and our very thought processes are all deeply embedded in the temporal dimension. Thus, attempting to grasp the relationship between God and time is akin to a fish trying to understand the ocean from within its watery domain, a formidable, perhaps even impossible, task. However, the difficulty of the challenge should not deter us. By carefully examining different perspectives, both theological and philosophical, and by embracing a certain degree of intellectual humility, we can gain a richer and more nuanced appreciation of the profound mystery at hand. Let us, therefore, delve into the depths of this timeless enigma, exploring the arguments for and against God's existence within and outside of time, and considering the implications of each perspective for our understanding of the divine and our place in the universe. 1. Time's intricate tapestry, defining the battlefield. Before we can even begin to explore God's relationship to time, we must first attempt to define what we mean by time itself. This is no simple matter, as the concept of time has been understood and interpreted in a myriad of ways throughout history. Newtonian time, the absolute and universal clock, the classical Newtonian view of time portrays it as an absolute and universal framework, a relentless and uniform flow that exists independently of any observer or event. Time, in this perspective, is like a vast, unchanging river that carries all of existence along its current. It is a fundamental property of the universe, a stage upon which the drama of reality unfolds. In this model, time is linear, irreversible, and infinitely divisible. Einsteinian time, the relative and dynamic fabric. Einstein's theory of relativity revolutionized our understanding of time, shattering the Newtonian notion of its absolute and universal nature. Relativity posits that time is relative, meaning that its passage is dependent on the observer's frame of reference and the speed at which they are moving. Time is not a separate entity, but rather an integral dimension of space-time, a unified fabric that is warped and curved by gravity and mass. In this view, time is not a fixed and immutable constant, but rather a dynamic and malleable dimension that is intimately linked to space and matter. Psychological time, the subjective flow of consciousness. Beyond the physical dimensions of time, there exists a psychological dimension, a subjective experience of duration and sequence that is unique to each individual. Psychological time is not a precise and objective measurement, but rather a fluid and subjective perception that is influenced by our emotions, our memories, and our level of attention. Time seems to fly by when we are engaged in enjoyable activities, and it drags on endlessly when we are bored or suffering. This subjective experience of time highlights the inherent limitations of our perception and the ways in which our minds actively shape our reality. Philosophical time, the elusive nature of present moment. Philosophers have grappled with the nature of time for centuries, exploring the paradoxes and ambiguities that arise from our attempts to define and understand it. One central question concerns the nature of the present moment. Does it truly exist, or is it merely a fleeting transition between the past and the future? Some philosophers argue that only the present is real, while the past is gone and the future is yet to come. Others maintain that the past, present, and future are equally real, existing simultaneously in a timeless dimension. These philosophical debates highlight the fundamental challenges of grasping the elusive nature of time and its relationship to our consciousness. For the purpose of this exploration, we need to understand time not just as a physical dimension or a psychological experience, but as a framework of sequential events. This framework, whether absolute or relative, is what dictates our understanding of causality, change, and the very nature of existence as we know it. 2. The God of time, embracing the temporal flow. The perspective that God exists within time, often referred to as temporalism or presentism, proposes that God is intimately involved in the unfolding events of the universe. This view paints a picture of a dynamic and responsive God, one who acts within the temporal framework, experiencing the passage of time along with creation. Biblical narratives and divine action. One of the strongest arguments for God's existence within time stems from the biblical narratives themselves. Throughout the Old and New Testaments, we encounter a God who interacts directly with human history, intervening in specific events, responding to prayers, and adapting to changing circumstances. God makes promises, enters into covenants, and experiences emotions such as joy, anger, and sorrow. These depictions suggest a God who is not detached from the temporal realm, but rather deeply engaged in its unfolding drama. Process theology. God as the fellow sufferer. Process theology, a school of thought developed by Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne, offers a sophisticated philosophical framework for understanding God's temporality. Process theologians argue that God is not an immutable and unchanging being, but rather a dynamic and evolving entity who is influenced by the world and who in turn influences the world. God is conceived as the fellow sufferer who understands, a being who empathizes with the joys and sorrows of creation and who actively works to bring about greater good in the world. Open theism, embracing uncertainty and freedom. Open theism, a more recent theological perspective, takes the concept of God's temporality even further. Open theists argue that God does not possess complete and exhaustive foreknowledge of the future, but rather that the future is open and contingent, shaped by the free choices of human beings. God, in this view, knows all that is logically knowable, but the future is not yet determined and is therefore unknowable, even to God. This perspective emphasizes the importance of human freedom and responsibility, and it paints a picture of a God who is genuinely surprised and challenged by the unfolding events of history. The appeal of relational theology. The notion of a temporal God resonates with many believers because it portrays God as relatable and accessible. If God exists within time, then God can understand our struggles, empathize with our pain, and respond to our prayers in a meaningful way. This perspective offers a sense of comfort and connection, suggesting that God is not a distant and aloof deity, but rather a loving and compassionate presence who is actively involved in our lives. However, the concept of a temporal God also raises some serious theological challenges. The problem of divine mutability. If God exists within time, then God must be subject to change. But how can a perfect and immutable being be subject to change? If God changes, then God must have been less perfect at one point in time than at another, which seems to contradict the traditional understanding of divine perfection. The limits of divine knowledge. If God exists within time, then God may not possess complete and exhaustive knowledge of the future. But how can a being who lacks complete knowledge of the future be considered omniscient? If God does not know what will happen tomorrow, then God cannot be said to be all-knowing. The challenge to divine sovereignty: if God exists within time, then God may be limited in God's ability to control the course of events. But how can a being who is limited in power be considered omnipotent? If God is constrained by the laws of nature and the free choices of human beings, then God cannot be said to be all-powerful. These challenges have led many theologians and philosophers to embrace the alternative perspective, the notion of a God who exists outside of time. 3. The timeless God, dwelling in eternity's embrace. The perspective that God exists outside of time, often referred to as eternalism or simultaneity, proposes that God transcends the temporal framework altogether. This view paints a picture of a God who is immutable, timeless, and all-knowing, a being who perceives all of past, present, and future in a single, eternal moment. Classical theism, the immutable and perfect being. Classical theism, rooted in the philosophical traditions of Plato and Aristotle, emphasizes the immutability and perfection of God. Classical theists argue that God is a simple, unchanging, and necessary being, a being who is not subject to the limitations of time and space. God is conceived as the ultimate source of all being, the unmoved mover who sets the universe in motion, but who is not himself affected by the world. Augustine's vision of eternity. St. Augustine, one of the most influential theologians in Christian history, offered a powerful vision of God's timelessness in his Confessions. Augustine argued that God does not experience time in the same way that human beings do. For God, there is no past, present, or future, but rather a single, eternal now. God sees all of time in a single glance, and God's knowledge is not limited by the constraints of temporal sequence. "Thy years neither come nor go," Augustine wrote, "whereas these years of ours both come and go, that they may all come." Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. Boethius, a 6th century Roman philosopher and statesman, further developed the concept of God's timelessness in his Consolation of Philosophy. Boethius argued that God's knowledge of the future does not necessitate determinism. God sees all of time simultaneously, but this does not mean that human actions are predetermined. Just as a person standing on a mountaintop can see the entire landscape below without causing the events that are unfolding, so too God can see all of time without causing the events that are occurring. The Thomistic synthesis. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theologian of the Middle Ages, synthesized the classical theism of Aristotle with the Christian theology of Augustine. Aquinas argued that God is pure act, a being who is fully actualized and who lacks no potential. God is not subject to change because God is already perfect in every way. Aquinas also argued that God's knowledge is not limited by time. God knows all of past, present, and future in a single, eternal act of understanding. The logical implications of omniscience and omnipotence. The concept of a timeless God is often seen as a necessary consequence of divine omniscience and omnipotence. If God is truly all-knowing, then God must know the future as well as the past and the present. But how can God know the future if the future is still contingent and undetermined? The only way to reconcile divine omniscience with human freedom, many theologians argue, is to posit that God exists outside of time, perceiving all of time in a single, eternal moment. Similarly, if God is truly all-powerful, then God must be able to act independently of the constraints of time and space. But how can God act independently of time and space if God exists within the temporal realm? The only way to reconcile divine omnipotence with the limitations of the physical universe, many theologians argue, is to posit that God exists outside of time, transcending the limitations of the created order. Addressing the problem of divine passibility, a timeless God avoids the issues that arise from divine mutability. If God is outside of time, he is not subject to change. But if God is unchanging and impassible, how can he truly love? How can he experience compassion or empathy? Proponents of a timeless God argue that God's love and compassion are not emotions that change him but are perfect, eternal aspects of his nature. He knows and understands suffering without experiencing it in the same way we do, a viewpoint sometimes called aseity. However, the concept of a timeless God also raises some serious theological challenges. The problem of divine action. If God exists outside of time, then how can God act within time? How can a timeless being intervene in the temporal realm? If God is immutable and unchanging, then how can God respond to prayers or perform miracles? These questions pose a significant challenge to the concept of divine action, suggesting that a timeless God may be unable to interact with the world in a meaningful way. The problem of meaningful prayer. If God exists outside of time and already knows the future, then what is the point of prayer? If God has already determined what will happen, then our prayers cannot possibly change anything. This question poses a significant challenge to the practice of prayer, suggesting that prayer may be a futile exercise if God is truly timeless and immutable. The problem of the Incarnation. The Christian doctrine of the Incarnation, which holds that God became incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ, poses a particular challenge to the concept of a timeless God. How can a timeless and immutable being become incarnate in a temporal and mutable human being? If God is outside of time, then how can God enter into time? This question raises profound questions about the nature of the Incarnation and the relationship between the divine and the human. The loss of relatability. A timeless God, however magnificent, can feel distant and inaccessible. The idea of a being who exists outside of time, perceiving all of history in a single glance, can be overwhelming and even intimidating. It can be difficult to relate to a God who does not share our temporal limitations and who seems to exist on a completely different plane of existence. 4. Bridging the divide, seeking reconciliation and synthesis. Given the inherent challenges and limitations of both temporalist and eternalist perspectives, many theologians and philosophers have attempted to bridge the divide between these two seemingly incompatible views. They seek to develop a more nuanced and comprehensive understanding of God's relationship to time, one that incorporates the strengths of both perspectives while avoiding their respective weaknesses. The concept of divine accommodation. One approach to reconciling the temporal and eternal perspectives is to appeal to the concept of divine accommodation. This concept suggests that God, in revealing himself to humanity, accommodates his message to our limited understanding. God speaks to us in terms that we can comprehend, even if those terms do not fully capture the reality of the divine nature. Thus, the biblical narratives that depict God as acting within time may be understood as accommodations to our temporal perspective, rather than literal descriptions of God's actual mode of being. God, in reality, may be timeless, but he chooses to interact with us in a way that we can understand. The distinction between God's eternal nows and temporal sequence. Another approach is to distinguish between God's eternal now and the temporal sequence of events in the created world. God, in this view, exists in an eternal present, perceiving all of time in a single, unified act of understanding. However, this does not mean that God is unaware of the temporal sequence of events in the world. Rather, God sees the past, present, and future simultaneously, understanding the causal relationships that connect events in time. This perspective allows for God to be both timeless and intimately involved in the unfolding of history. The analogy of the author and the story. Some theologians use the analogy of the author and the story to illustrate God's relationship to time. Just as an author exists outside of the story she creates, so too God exists outside of the universe he creates. The author knows the entire story from beginning to end, but this does not mean that the characters in the story lack free will. The characters make their own choices, and their actions shape the course of the narrative. Similarly, God knows the entire history of the universe, but this does not mean that human beings lack free will. We are free to make our own choices, and our actions shape the course of history. God, like the author, can intervene in the story, but he does so in a way that respects the integrity of the narrative and the freedom of the characters. The model of God as a cosmic programmer, in a more modern analogy, God can be envisioned as a cosmic programmer. The programmer designs the rules and laws of the universe, setting the stage for the unfolding of creation. He knows the potential outcomes based on the rules he has set, but he doesn't necessarily dictate every detail. The system evolves and develops based on the initial parameters and the interactions of the elements within it. This model allows for both God's knowledge and sovereignty and the freedom and agency of creatures within the system. Panentheism, God in and beyond the universe. Panentheism offers another intriguing perspective. It proposes that God encompasses and interpenetrates the universe, with the universe existing within God. Think of it like a sponge soaked in water. The water is both in and around the sponge. This allows for God to be both immanent, present within creation, and transcendent, beyond creation. In this view, God is not separate from time, but intimately involved in its unfolding, yet also exists beyond our temporal understanding. 5. Quantum conundrums: time, God, and the fabric of reality. The exploration of God's relationship to time also intersects with some of the most perplexing and fascinating questions in contemporary physics, particularly in the realm of quantum mechanics. The arrow of time and entropy. Physics describes time as having an arrow, meaning it flows in one direction, from past to future. This directionality is linked to the concept of entropy, which is the measure of disorder in a system. The second law of thermodynamics states that entropy always increases in a closed system. In simple terms, things tend to become more disordered over time. This increase in entropy provides the physical basis for the arrow of time. But the initial state of extremely low entropy is a mystery. Could this be the work of a creating God? Was this the act that set time into motion? Quantum entanglement and non-locality. Quantum entanglement is a phenomenon where two particles become linked together in such a way that they share the same fate, no matter how far apart they are separated. If you measure a property of one entangled particle, you instantly know the corresponding property of the other particle, even if they are light years away. This seemingly instantaneous connection challenges our classical understanding of causality and locality, the idea that an object is only directly influenced by its immediate surroundings. Some interpretations suggest that quantum entanglement implies a connection that transcends time and space, perhaps offering a glimpse into a reality that is not bound by the same constraints as our everyday experience. Could this non-locality be related to God's omnipresence? The many worlds interpretation and divine providence. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics proposes that every quantum measurement causes the universe to split into multiple parallel universes, each representing a different possible outcome. In this view, there is not just one future, but an infinite number of futures, each unfolding in its own separate universe. This interpretation raises profound questions about divine providence. If every possibility is realized in some universe, then does God have a specific plan for each individual in each universe? Or does God's providence operate at a higher level, guiding the overall evolution of the multiverse towards a greater good? The problem of quantum creation. One of the biggest questions is how the universe, or even the multiverse, came into being. Physics can describe the evolution of the universe after the Big Bang, but it struggles to explain the initial conditions or the origin of the universe itself. Some physicists propose that the universe arose from a quantum fluctuation, a spontaneous event that occurred in a pre-existing void. But this raises the question of where the void came from and what laws governed its existence. The concept of a God who transcends the universe and who is the ultimate source of all being offers a possible answer to this question, providing a metaphysical foundation for the existence of the physical universe. 6. The paradox of free will and divine foreknowledge. The question of God's relationship to time is inextricably linked to the age-old debate about free will and divine foreknowledge. If God exists outside of time and knows the future, then how can human beings be truly free? If God already knows what choices we will make, then are we really making those choices freely? Or are we simply acting out a predetermined script? Compatibilism. Reconciling freedom and determinism. Compatibilism, also known as soft determinism, is the view that free will and determinism are compatible. Compatibilists argue that we are free as long as our actions are caused by our own desires and beliefs, even if those desires and beliefs are themselves causally determined. In the context of divine foreknowledge, compatibilists might argue that God's knowledge of our future actions does not cause those actions, but rather simply reflects them. We are still free to choose what we want to do, but God already knows what we will choose. Libertarianism, emphasizing genuine freedom. Libertarianism, also known as incompatibilism, is the view that free will and determinism are incompatible. Libertarians argue that we are only truly free if our actions are not causally determined by anything outside of ourselves. In the context of divine foreknowledge, libertarians might argue that God's knowledge of the future is limited by our freedom. God knows all the possible choices that we could make, but He does not know which choice we will actually make until we make it. The Molinist solution, middle knowledge, Molinism, a theological perspective developed by the 16th century Jesuit theologian Luis de Molina, offers a sophisticated attempt to reconcile free will and divine foreknowledge. Molinists argue that God possesses three types of knowledge: natural knowledge, free knowledge, and middle knowledge. Natural knowledge is God's knowledge of all necessary truths, such as logical principles and mathematical axioms. Free knowledge is God's knowledge of what He will freely choose to do, such as creating the world and sending His Son to redeem humanity. Middle knowledge is God's knowledge of what every possible free creature would do in every possible circumstance. Before creating the world, God consulted His middle knowledge to determine which world would best achieve His purposes, while still allowing for human freedom. Molinism attempts to preserve both divine foreknowledge and human freedom by arguing that God's knowledge of our future actions is based on His understanding of what we would freely choose to do in any given situation. The open theist challenge, limiting divine foreknowledge. Open theists, as mentioned earlier, reject the notion of exhaustive divine foreknowledge. They argue that the future is genuinely open and contingent, shaped by the free choices of human beings. God, in this view, knows all that is logically knowable, but the future is not yet determined and is therefore unknowable, even to God. This perspective emphasizes the importance of human freedom and responsibility, and it paints a picture of a God who is genuinely surprised and challenged by the unfolding events of history. 7. Exploring the implications. What does it all mean? The question of God's relationship to time is not merely an abstract philosophical puzzle. It has profound implications for our understanding of God, ourselves, and the world around us. The nature of divine sovereignty. If God exists outside of time, then His sovereignty over the universe may be understood as absolute and complete. God has planned and orchestrated the entire course of history, and nothing can happen outside of His will. However, this view can lead to questions about the problem of evil. If God is in complete control, why does He allow suffering and injustice to exist? If God exists within time, then His sovereignty may be understood as more limited and relational. God works within the constraints of the temporal realm, responding to the choices of human beings and adapting to changing circumstances. This view allows for a greater emphasis on human freedom and responsibility, but it may also raise questions about the extent of God's power and control. The meaning of human existence. If God exists outside of time, then our lives may be seen as part of a larger, eternal plan. Our actions have meaning and significance beyond the immediate present, contributing to the unfolding of God's purposes in the universe. This view can provide a sense of hope and purpose, but it may also lead to questions about the value of individual experiences. If our lives are simply part of a larger plan, do our individual joys and sorrows really matter? If God exists within time, then our lives may be seen as more contingent and unpredictable. Our choices have real consequences, shaping the course of our own lives and the lives of others. This view emphasizes the importance of living in the present moment and making responsible choices, but it may also lead to feelings of anxiety and uncertainty about the future. The role of religion and spirituality. If God exists outside of time, then religion and spirituality may be seen as ways of connecting with the eternal realm. Prayer, meditation, and contemplation can help us to transcend the limitations of our temporal existence and to experience the presence of God in our lives. This view emphasizes the importance of seeking spiritual enlightenment and union with the divine. If God exists within time, then religion and spirituality may be seen as ways of engaging with the world and working to bring about justice and peace. Our faith can inspire us to act ethically and compassionately, transforming our lives and the lives of others. This view emphasizes the importance of social action and ethical living. The nature of hope and eschatology. Our understanding of God's relationship to time also shapes our understanding of hope and eschatology, the study of the end times. If God is timeless, then hope might be rooted in the promise of eternal life, a state of being outside of time where we experience the fullness of God's presence. Eschatology might focus on the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan for the cosmos, a final state of perfection and harmony. If God is temporal, then hope might be rooted in the anticipation of a better future, a future where justice and peace prevail. Eschatology might focus on the progressive realization of God's kingdom on earth, a transformation of the world through the power of love and grace. 8. The enduring mystery, a journey without a destination. Ultimately, the question of God's relationship to time remains an enduring mystery. There are compelling arguments on both sides of the debate, and no definitive answer seems possible. Perhaps the very question itself is flawed, based on our limited human understanding of time and eternity. However, the journey of exploring this question is itself valuable. By wrestling with the complexities of divine temporality and eternity, we can deepen our understanding of God, ourselves, and the nature of reality. We can learn to appreciate the limitations of our own perspectives and to embrace the mystery that lies at the heart of existence. Perhaps the most important lesson to be learned from this exploration is the need for intellectual humility. We must acknowledge that our understanding of God will always be partial and incomplete. We are finite creatures attempting to comprehend an infinite being, and our efforts will inevitably fall short. However, this does not mean that we should abandon the quest for knowledge. Rather, we should approach the question of God's relationship to time with a spirit of open-mindedness and curiosity, willing to learn from different perspectives and to challenge our own assumptions. Ultimately, the question of God's relationship to time may be a question that can only be answered through faith and experience, rather than through reason and logic alone. Perhaps the best way to understand God's relationship to time is to cultivate a deep and personal relationship with the divine, allowing ourselves to be transformed by the love and grace of God. So, does God exist in time or outside time? The answer, it seems, remains shrouded in a veil of mystery. But perhaps, in the very act of seeking, we find ourselves closer to the truth, a truth that transcends our temporal limitations and invites us into the boundless realm of eternity. The journey continues, and the quest for understanding, like the love of God, is timeless. And perhaps, in the end, the most important thing is not to find a definitive answer, but to embrace the mystery with humility, wonder, and unwavering faith.